So today we're going to look at two different methods on how to set up your multi-brand design system in Token Studio that can sync with your Figma variables, starting with a branded house approach before we move into the house of brands approach. Let's get started. With you being here, I'm going to make the assumption that you're familiar with the one brand design system. So as an example, Coca-Cola. It's not the Coca-Cola company because again, there's lots of brands that fall underneath it, but we're just talking about Coca-Cola for now. And I'm sure you're familiar with it where it's just red and white. Now, that's just one design system, so a one brand design system, but there's also something that we call a branded house design system, where again, still using the Coca-Cola example, Coca-Cola has Coca-Cola Classic, Diet Coke, Coke Zero, each of which has different primary and secondary colors. Now, just because they have different primary secondary colors, the majority of the other design components or elements will roughly stay the same. You know, the fonts, the components, the spacing, borders, grids, corner radiuses, so on and so forth. It's really just that there's some slight deviations in your primary, secondary color palettes. But they all do tie back to a brand. And a little bit of a visual of this is we have our brand, and then we have our themes that fall underneath it. So we have our brand, our Coca-Cola Classic, our Coca-Cola Zero, and our Diet Coke. And each of those share the same light and dark theme. And they all tie back to the exact same brand palette. So this is what we call a branded house approach. But there is also, we can also go that next level down in terms of overall brands. So we're going to look at the Coca-Cola Company. So the Coca-Cola Company has a ton of different brands that fall underneath it, all of which have different colors and different everything. So I think when I was doing some research for this video, I think they have some like 50 to 75 sub-brands that fall underneath it. Not all that you're familiar with. It's sub-brands of sub-brands. It's quite a complex web. But we're going to focus on Coca-Cola, Powerade, Minute Maid, and Vitamin Water for now. So you can see that all the fonts, components, corner radiuses, colors, spacing, borders, grids, and shadows are specific to the individual theme or sub-brand, as you might call it. And that's the same for Powerade, Minute Maid, Vitamin Water. So you can see how complex this can get, especially if you're a design lead or designer expected to work with a lot of these brands or bouncing around between them. So it's really important that you structure your tokens or your variables correctly. So again, a little bit of visual of this is you have your global brand, you have your brands that fall underneath it, you then have your themes, and then each of your themes would have their own light mode and dark mode. So instead of each of your themes sharing the same light mode and dark mode, what you're actually doing is building a light mode and dark mode for each of those different themes. So it's a little bit more complex. This provides you a lot more control over your tokens when compared against the branded house approach. So again, it really depends the type of brand that you are and ultimately your objectives for your design system, which could alter the option that you choose and ultimately how you structure your tokens. So let's start off building out our multi-brand design system using Token Studio with our branded house approach. So let me open up our plugins here, Token Studio for Figma, and we'll start with a new empty file. I'm going to rename global to brand. And now let's set our brand colors. Again, our brand colors for Coke as a whole. So not specific to Diet Coke, Coke Classic, Coke Zero, or anything else, but the brand colors for Coca-Cola. So let's set a red 500. And again, the naming and scaling here, this is just placeholder. Each design system's different. So yours might not be 500. You might use a different scale. So red 500, this will be a color for Coke Classic. We're also going to need a gray. So let's say gray 200, which is a little bit lighter. There we go. Let's also create a gray 800. And this is a little bit darker. And then let's just create a white. And what do you think? That looks like Coca-Cola's colors, right? Perfect. So let's then create alias themes. So our alias themes, this is when we get into more specifics. So we go into Coke Classic, Coke Zero, and Diet Coke that tie back to our brand colors themselves. So let me walk you through one to start off with. So let's go alias Coke. And again, if you're not familiar with like your brand themes, your alias themes, your map themes, we do have a video that explains all that. I'll put the link in the description. So we have our alias Coke. And now let's tie it back. So we're going to have a primary color for Coke, again, because this is our Coke brand itself. And what we're going to do is we're tying it back to the brand color. So red 500. Great. So again, we have our primary color for our Coke brand, which is red 500, which ties back to our brand color, which is red 500. Let's then create a secondary color. And the secondary color for Coca-Cola, Coke Classic, is white. So let's tie it back to white. Again, so now we have a secondary color, for the Coke brand, and a primary color for the Coke brand, Coca-Cola Classic brand, that tie back to our overall Coca-Cola brand colors. So again, we have our red 500 and we have our white, and we have our primary and secondary colors, which tie back to those two. Let's then do the same, but for Diet Coke. Alias, Diet Coke. And now let's create colors again. So we have our primary. And we're going to tie this back to our gray 200, because it's Diet Coke, it's a little bit lighter. And then our secondary is actually going to be our red. So our red 500. So one thing you'll notice is for Coke Classic, the primary is red, but for Diet Coke, our secondary is red. Let's also do the same for Coke Zero. Create. And let's create a primary, which will be that darker color, so the gray. And then let's also create a secondary, which will be, let's go with the red. Sure, why not? There we go. So we have our brand colors again. Now we have their maps to our alias themes. So our Coke, our Diet Coke, and our Coke Zero. And because they're separate brands, their primaries and secondaries and other colors are different. Now, that might not be the case for your brand. That might not be the case for every brand, but for this example, that's what we're rolling with. And again, you would like to think that with these alias themes, all of their sizing, spacing, border radius, border width, so on and so forth is relatively similar. And our branded house approach works when there's only some subtle variations between each of your alias themes. And that's what we're doing right here. Okay, so we've got our alias themes established. Now we need to map them to a map theme. So this is where you get into things like your light mode or your dark mode. We're not going to touch upon dark mode today. We're only going to focus on light mode for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new set, and we'll call it Map Light. Let's create. There we go. So in our light, this is where we get into some of the naming conventions, for your surfaces, your borders, your text. And again, I would check out the link that we have in the description for our other YouTube video that goes into that a little bit more in depth. But for this, what we're going to do is let's rock with a surface action. Surface action. And one thing you'll notice here is that all we have to choose from are our brand colors, which doesn't make much sense, because then why did we map to alias? What you actually need to do is you need to turn on your alias. So in this example, I'm just going to turn on Coke. So now, select light as well, color. Yep, so I'm in the light theme, color. So now if I go, this will be our surface action color. I can see that I now also have our primary colors. And our secondary colors, we don't just have the branded colors. Because again, we don't want to skip over alias. Think of it as almost as if you're working from the top down. Your brand needs to map somewhere. Your alias needs to map somewhere. And ideally, those map to your light theme and your dark theme. You don't want to go right from your light theme and dark theme to your brand colors. You need to have something in between. So again, let's just turn off. Let's just go with turn Coke on. So now I'm going to add a color on our light. Again, surface action. Surface action, excuse me. So now I see we have our primary and our secondary. but it looks like there's a little bit of a break. That's because I didn't have my brand on. Sorry about that. So again, so we have our surface action, and let's create another one. Let's go with a text action, and this is going to be our secondary. Yep, that's our secondary. There we go. Okay, so we've got our surface, and we've got our text color. Now, look what happens. So if I turn on Diet Coke, now all of a sudden it overwrites. So our mapped theme, light, is now in the Diet Coke colors. And if I add Coke Zero, look what happens. It overwrites. So if you're working within the branded house approach, you can only have one of these on at a time, or else you notice that your colors are getting overwritten by the alias theme. So for now, I like to have it at Coke. So next, what we're going to do is actually look at creating our variables and some of the weird nuances associated with creating your variables. And we're going to apply those to a button. So now let's actually look at creating the variables, building a little bit of a component, and then creating modes to show how this all works. So what we're going to do is under styles and variables, you'll notice right off the bat that create variables is disabled. And that's because we don't have any themes yet. So let me go to our themes. And what we're actually going to need to do is create a theme for our brand, for our alias Coke, for our alias Diet Coke, for our alias Coke Zero, and for our mapped light. So each of them are going to get their own theme. So let's create a theme. Let's call this brand, and just our default. And we don't want this. We don't want this. We just want brand enabled. Again, we don't want brand source, but brand enabled. So I'm going to save that theme. Let's create a theme for our alias Coke. And again, this is where the naming convention is really important to get it right because it is also case sensitive. So we're going to select alias Coke, turn that off, alias Coke, alias Coke. There we got another theme. And I can see that there's no issues with it because it says one set. We also want an alias Diet Coke. You know the drill. Make sure it's enabled. Rock and roll. Let's also go with an alias Coke Zero. Make sure that's enabled. That one's disabled. Alias Coke Zero. Beautiful. And then we also want a mapped light. So let's make sure that's enabled. Turn that one off. This one as well. So we got our mapped light. Mapped light is enabled. Beautiful. Just what we want to see. So now what we need to do is let's go ahead and create those variables. But you're probably asking is, okay, so our surface and text, whereas before they were red and white, now they are that dark gray and that red, and that's because we have Coke Zero on again. So if I just switch them back, there we go. So now let's go ahead and let's create those variables. So now I see 3 collections and 8 variables have been created. Let me go into our local variables, and here I see everything. Okay, so we've got our mapped surface action. We've also got our brand, and we've also got our alias. So let's just go through a quick demo here. Okay, so if we go to our mapped, and we select Diet Coke, we notice that the variables don't change with it. You know, this isn't the end of the world. It's not supposed to do that. Where this kind of functionality really comes in handy is when you're working with modes. So even though it doesn't show the specific brand that you're on in your variables, those colors are always there for you to pull on. Let's dive deeper. So let's create a lightning quick button component. Let's call this button. Right click, add some auto layout or Shift A. Let's add a fill with our surface action and our text for our text action. And let's make this a little bit more buttony. So let's maybe go with a 50. There we go. I always like 4 pixels. So let's call this button. Let's then create the component, copy a symbol, and now let's add a couple frames. There we go. So this will be our Coke. This will be our Diet Coke. And this will be our Coke Zero. There we go. So I'm going to bring our symbol in, select the frame, make sure this is set to Coke. Let's do the same, but we're going to set this to Diet Coke. And now you see how our symbols are actually changing. So even though it's not showing that it's there in the variables, they're there technically. So this will be our Coke Zero, and there we have our buttons. There you go. So that's how you sync your variables, get that all set up, cover some of the nuances associated with it. All right, so now let's look at setting up our House of Brands approach within Token Studio for a multi-brand design system. So just as a little bit of a refresher, you have your brand, you have your themes underneath it, so your sub-brands, and each of those are going to have their own light mode and dark mode. So whereas before with the branded house approach, each of your themes, your sub-brands will share the same light mode and dark mode. Here, this is when you'd actually separate them out. So it gives you a little bit more control and flexibility. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and open Token Studio. I'm also just going to lock this layer. There we go. So let's start with a new empty file. And just as we did before, let's rename this to brand. But instead of what we did with the branded house approach, where we put all of our colors under brand, now we're going to work with two brands. So we're actually going to work with Coke and Powerade. So what you can do is it'd be brand Coke. So you're creating a different folder under that brand. And let's do a brand Powerade. So again, instead of all your colors being within just the one brand parent folder, you're breaking them out separately now to offer more control. Because again, Coke and Powerade are two very, very separate brands. I'm sure they might have some colors that are the same, but Powerade works with colors like green, blue, yellow, orange, whereas Coke, it has its very own specific brand that we reviewed earlier on, where it's more reds, blacks, and grays. So with these, it's going to be best to separate them out because especially their light mode and dark mode are going to be incredibly different. So let's start off with Coke again, and I'm not going to go through all of the colors as we did last time. I'll probably just do one or two for each. So let's start off with our red 500, and let's go just set that there. And let's also do a white, and we're going to set that to white. There we go. And then for Powerade, what we can do is let's do a red 500. But again, just to show why it's important to separate them out, is Powerade's red 500 might be a little bit lighter. So if we compare the Powerade red to the Coke red, we notice that the Coke red is a little bit much stronger. So again, best to separate them out. Next, let's also do maybe a blue 500. I know Powerade's got a nice blue. Something like that's fine. And then let's do a gray 100. And it's not quite black, but a really deep, deep gray. Something like that works. All right, sweet. So, and you know what, just for consistency purposes, let's maybe do one more color for our Coke brands. Let's do a gray 200 for, again, Diet Coke. So let's set that as such, and then create. Beautiful. So we've got our two brands set up. Now let's focus on the aliases. So what we're actually going to do is, again, create an alias for Coke, create an alias for Diet Coke, and then create an alias for our different Powerade colors themselves. So starting off with Coke, we're going to do alias Coke dash Coke. So what we're saying here is it's the alias of our Coke brand, but our Coca-Cola Classic theme that falls underneath it. So again, maybe we'll do another example with Diet Coke just to, because I know Coke can be confusing. So Coke, Diet Coke. So it's the Coke brand and then the Diet Coke sub-brand that falls underneath it. And again, let's do the same for Powerade. So we have a red and our blue. So let's do a alias Powerade blue. Beautiful. And let's do a alias Powerade red. So it offers a little bit of a nice distinction, a nice organization, putting the parent brand first with your alias. So let's then go ahead and tie these back. So let's turn Coke on. So Coke, again, this is going to be our primary. Our primary is going to be so what's going on here? This on, our primary, and let's set that to red. And then our secondary will be our white. And again, for Diet Coke, our primary will be our gray, and our secondary will be our red. And then let's move on to Powerade. So with Powerade, we got this is our Powerade blue. So our primary will be that Powerade blue color, and our secondary will be that deep gray. Great. And then let's do Powerade red. So let's set our primary to that Powerade red, and then our secondary to that deep gray. Beautiful. That works just fine. Turn that off. There we go. Just play around with a couple things here. So we got our primary red, secondary. Turn that off so now it doesn't override. So again, Coke, we got our primary, secondary. Diet Coke, we got our primary, secondary. Let me turn Powerade on. So then primary for our blue, we have our primary, secondary, and then for our red, we have our primary and secondary. Beautiful. So next, let's look at actually mapping this down. And again, this is where each of our different themes here, sub-brands, are going to have their own light mode and dark mode. So what we're actually going to do is let's go mapped Coke. Mapped Coke-Coke. Again, still following the same alias theme, but then it's going to be light. So we're going to create that. And let's do for dark, it's going to be our mapped Coke-Coke-dark. So again, it's our Coca-Cola classic theme under our Coke brand for light mode and then dark mode. And I know that the Coke can again be confusing. So let's maybe do one for Diet Coke as well. Coke-Diet Coke light. And then a mapped Coke Diet Coke dark. Again, so now we have a light mode and dark mode for each of our different individual themes within it. And let's just maybe do one Powerade. So our mapped Powerade, what do we call it? Our blue dash light. There we go. Then we go with Powerade. Mapped Powerade blue dash dark. And then we're going to create that. And that's how we would set up our individual structure. So then for our Powerade blue, what we can do, so I'm going to turn off Powerade red, is this can be our surface action. And we're going to set that again to our primary. And then maybe we might also have a surface secondary. Or not surface secondary. So this is our surface action. Forgive me, then maybe we have like a surface inverted. That might be that secondary color. So then that would be for our light theme. Again, mapping our surfaces. Maybe we'll just do one for Coke Light. So let's turn off Powerade and let's turn on Coke. So and set this to Coke Light. And then maybe we do again, so a surface action would be our red color, our primary red color, excuse me. And then maybe we might also have a text action that would be for our secondary color. Beautiful. So there is a quick introduction into how we would set up our multi-brand design system in Token Studio for our House of Brands approach. Thanks for watching, everyone. I do know that this concept can be really confusing, especially if you're new to design systems, working with your variables or Token Studio. So feel free, just if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. You can also join the UI Collective Slack, and we can chat about it directly. And I'm totally happy to jump on a couple calls with anyone who has specific questions. I'd also like to encourage everyone to sign up for uicollective.co. We've got all this awesome design system training, design system support, and more. We did also just recently launch our UI Collective design system, where you get access to all of these amazing components across light mode and dark mode, but this is a paid template. Thanks again for watching. Hope to see you online, UI Collective.